Okay, welcome back to Racial and Ethnic Minorities. Um, I'm your instructor, Professor Dr. Jonathan Grant, and um, today we're going to talk about Black Lives Matter, Essay 24. Black Lives Matter is racist. It should be All Lives Matter. All Lives Matter as post-racial rhetoric. And we're also going to talk a little bit about Ta-Nehisi Coates' work Between the World and Me. Sorry, had a little brain fart just there. Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, a very powerful text. If you're in my, which class? If you're in my race, place and inequality class, I believe we've had some intense discussion about that, particularly around, and if you're in my sociological theory class, we've talked about that in relationship to 20th century Black political thought and James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. So both of those classes, we've had conversations about Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me. So hope you enjoy it. So get started. First things first, you have a quiz. It is available November 8th on Monday. It will cover the reading essay 24, Black Lives Matter is Racist. It has 5 to 10 questions related to the reading. The questions to the quiz will be available under files, reading quizzes. It will be entitled Quiz 3, Black Lives Matter, 1 p.m. On Monday, November 8th is when it is due. You will have when it will be available, you will have 24 hours until 1 p.m. November 9th, Tuesday, to complete it. On a separate Microsoft Word document, you're going to record your answers to the questions, and you're going to go to the assignments link and click on the reading quizzes and find the portal that says Quiz 3, Black Lives Matter, and you're going to upload your answers there. Those submissions after the deadline will be graded under any circumstances. If you have questions, reach out to me during office hours. I'll be more than happy to help you. Deadline for the quiz, 1 p.m., November 9th on Tuesday. You've taken quizzes, so by this time you should know this, and you may have one more quiz after this, and that'll probably be it. You might, I don't even know if I'll be able to fit in one more quiz. I'll try, but if not, then you may just have those 3 quizzes and then your exam 3. So we'll see how that goes in terms of time. So Black Lives Matter. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I don't think we can really have, especially now in this day and age, you can't really have a class on race and not go into detail about Black Lives Matter. And I do believe that as we move forward, in terms of history, as you all get older, and then maybe you may grow up and have kids, or if you don't want kids, or you have nieces or nephews or something like that, I'm pretty sure they're going to be studying the Black Lives Matter movement and what life was like for U.S. citizens between the years of 2010, 2011, up till the pandemic, as a very significant time in American history. For sure. I don't think anything, I don't want to say anything, but there has been few moments that have been like this, especially the year of 2020, where right in the middle of a global pandemic, you have these racial uprisings and racial resistance because of the way Black people have historically been treated by law enforcement. So yeah, it's just an incredible time. So I know that in the future, these stories and these teachings will probably be on the same level as how we now look at, the civil rights movement, et cetera. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today, how the Black Lives Matter movement got started and where it is now, and then kind of take a critical race theoretical analysis on what it means, okay? So Black Lives Matter started out as a response to a court case. Does anybody know what court case, what situation occurred that really started this movement? Now, if you recall, I was in my 20s, but you all were maybe in middle school, elementary, middle school, but you may have heard it. You may have heard about it. Prior to this court case, there have always been issues around race and conversations around race, particularly around race and law enforcement for a long time. Since slavery, really, since the creation of police, law enforcement, and its mistreatment of minorities, particularly Black people, particularly poor working class Black people. That's been a thing for, since the 60s. So it's always been a part of the conversation. Once particularly hip hop culture became an important part of the American discourse, you had groups like NWA who came out with songs like F the Police. You had other groups such as Boogie Down Productions come out with songs like Sound of the Police to address police brutality in poor and working class neighborhoods in the inner city. That's happening all in the 80s and in the 1990s and in the 2000s, where you also have issues like the Jena 6. You also have shootings like Oscar Grant, shootings like Sean Bell occurring, Oscar Grant in California, Sean Bell in New York. But it was one particular incident that actually did not have to do with law enforcement, but was really the thing that kind of set off the movement, at least on a digital scale, and that was the murder of Trayvon Martin. When Trayvon Martin was murdered by George Zimmerman, not too far from where we are here at UNF, that murder, the fact that George Zimmerman did not immediately go to jail, and then eventually he was arrested, and then eventually there was a court case, a very worldwide, very high profile court case, and then a court case in which George Zimmerman was acquitted, was what really kind of sparked the Black Lives Matter movement. There was a lot of outrage about George Zimmerman being acquitted for killing Trayvon Martin. And it was this acquittal that really started to turn this digital kind of movement, this sounding cry, into something that was a bit more organized. Very similar, right? It was the Brown versus Board of Education court case that kind of sparked the civil rights movement, right? It was that, and it gave the civil rights movement some power. I will probably say that, and then in addition to the murder of Emmett Till. Some of you may have heard of the murder of Emmett Till. Some of you may have seen pictures or just heard about it. Emmett Till was a young Black boy. I want to say he was about 11 or 12 years old. He was from Chicago. His mother was from Mississippi. She sent him home one summer from school to go be with his family in Mississippi and hang out. This was in the 1950s. She told him, this is how you behave. You can't behave the same way in Chicago that you do in Mississippi. It's a very, very different place. If you see white people, put your head down, things like that. He wasn't used to that. He was a little boy. He just thought about the things that he did in Chicago. When he got down to Mississippi, he saw a white woman that he thought, the story goes that he saw a white woman and he whistled at her. Either he whistled at her or he said, "Hey, baby," to this white woman, and she was appalled. She went to tell, I think it was her husband, and then her husband got his friends, some people together, and they killed the young man and not only killed the little boy, not the young man, the little boy, killed the little boy, but then they mutilated his body, mutilated his face. There are pictures of it online. Pretty much his face was, turned inside out essentially, and it's a horrible, horrible, horrible image. But it was this image, and these gentlemen would eventually be acquitted. Um, Nothing, severe would happen to them. And this would actually spark the civil rights movement, right? So very similarly, in that there's a court case and that there is a murder of an innocent child that is kind of setting off, just like it did with the civil rights movement, the same thing that happened with the Black Lives Matter movement. And Trayvon Martin, and these images and the imagery of seeing these deaths is also what kind of sparks people, both Black, white, people of various racial groups, to get on board with these movements. Same way that the image of this boy being, mutilated, his mother insisted that his funeral will be an open casket because they wanted the picture to be seen to show the devastation that people, particularly Black people in the South, had to deal with. And it was the same way with Trayvon Martin, seeing his lifeless body. You could Google those images. I remember seeing those images on social media and all over the news. Seeing the image of his lifeless body was what really kind of stuck into the minds of many people to say, we have to do something about these injustices. And so, as again, going back to 2010, 11, 12, around the time that Trayvon Martin is murdered, and then the subsequent acquittal of George Zimmerman causes people to want to do something. One person in particular was a woman by the name of Alicia Garza. And so she saw this as a defining moment for her generation. Alicia Garza is one of the 3 women that started the Black Lives Matter movement, and started this as a hashtag. Another key point around the Black Lives Matter movement, very similarly to the civil rights movement, was that it also came about during the on the cusp of technological advancement. So as technology advances and as people have easier access to information and images and ideas and discourse, oftentimes you see resistance, you see leaders, you see social consciousness using this as a means of getting out a message to the masses. Very similarly, the civil rights movement became popular not just because of the injustices surrounding it, not just because this, it just didn't so happen to be a pivotal time in American history, but because this was also the onset and the popularization of televisions. Televisions became very popular in the 1950s. It existed, I think, in the 30s and 40s too, but only very, very rich and wealthy people had televisions. But as televisions became more popular and as more common people had televisions, now people had access to the news, they had access to commentary, they had access to information, and they had access to being able to see images that they had not had access to before. Before that, everybody just kind of listened to the radio to get their information. So now in the 1950s and the 1960s, more common people have at least one small television set in their home. And the leaders of the civil rights movement use that to their advantage to say, listen, if we can get the news cameras to come out and see us marching, see us protesting peacefully, praying, and then having water being sprayed and dogs, singers being attacked by dogs, this will spark the consciousness, not only Black people in America, but actually white people who care about, other people's humanity despite their race. This will then cause more people to get on board. So they use television, they use news, they use cameras to their advantage to get the information out there, to get the images out there, to get the message out there on what was going on. In that same way, Alicia Garza and the Black Lives Matter group use hashtags, use social media, use the fact that now people are getting everything on their phone and said, we're going to use this phone. We're going to use Facebook. We're going to use Instagram. We're going to use Twitter. We're going to use these platforms to get our message out, just like the civil rights movement used cameras and used TVs to get their message out. So the meeting of technology and messaging and the raising of consciousness, as well as a response to an event, typically all of these kinds of components are put in place and come at just the right time to help set off these very impactful movements. Same way with civil rights movement, and actually it was the same way with the Civil War as well. I won't go that far back, but you can also make that same claim for the Civil War as well, of the Civil War, civil rights movement, and also Black Lives Matter movement. And so when Alicia Garza was interviewed and talked about how she felt after the Trayvon Martin was murdered and then George Zimmerman was eventually acquitted, she said it was as if we had all been punched in the gut. And I think that is a good example of how a lot of people felt. I know that is an example of how a lot of Black people felt. I'm pretty sure a lot of white people who did not agree with that verdict probably felt very similarly. That it just, just kind of knocked the wind out of people. And so Garza, again, also didn't like the fact that there was this response to the verdict that she saw on social media by other groups, right? By other people saying that we should not just say Black Lives Matter, but we should say that all lives matter. And that's a whole, we're going to get into that topic in a little while. So there were these responses by people on social media that caused folks who were saying that Black Lives Matter and starting this hashtag and eventually taking this hashtag and turning it into a movement and into an organization to do so because of some of the responses that they were seeing on places like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. And so on August 9th, 2014, we see another African-American male that was shot and killed by a white police officer, Darren Wilson, in Ferguson, Missouri, Michael Brown. And I think it was after Michael Brown that you start to see this notion of Black Lives Matter go from being a hashtag to now really materializing into an actual movement. And the demonstrations that follow, the riots that follow, went on for weeks and weeks and weeks. And shortly after that, Eric Garner, who was a 43-year-old Black man, had died after being placed in a chokehold by a white police officer in New York. And so the aftermath of this was racial violence in America, and these things had reached a boiling point in the mid part of the 2000s. And all while this is happening, the chanting of Black Lives Matter, the thought that Black lives did not matter because these things were perpetually happening over and over and over again. And it would seem like every day, every other day, there was a new person, another person dying at the hands of the police. And these things were just constantly happening consistently, and not just in one area. Because some people say, well, that's a Southern thing, the South, they're racist. Or it just happens in the big city, in places like New York and Chicago and LA, and they're corrupt out there. But what was happening was these things were happening in various places. So they were happening in big cities, they were happening in small cities, they were happening in the South, they were happening in the North, they were happening in the Midwest, they were happening in the West Coast, they were happening in predominantly Black cities, they were happening in predominantly white cities, they were happening everywhere. And so it was now very clear that this is not just an individual problem. It was one of the things that was done with the Trayvon Martin case was that it was said, well, Trayvon Martin may have provoked George Zimmerman, and We don't know what happened with that exchange, and this had nothing to do with race. This was an individual thing. But after you start to see this happening over and over and over again with different types of people, different areas, different places, different genders, not just black boys, but black girls, not just black men, but black women. Now it's starting to see, oh, well, maybe this thing is more systemic. Maybe there really is a problem. And I do believe that maybe, and so then that's when you have, of course, we all know the George Floyd case is the most popular case of this time. And we see the results of that case. I would argue that those results came as a consequence of the Black Lives Matter movement, as a consequence of continual agitation for weeks and months and years, for almost a decade, before you come to a situation of somewhat justice. Had Trayvon Martin's case been in 2020, George Zimmerman probably would have gone to prison. But because it was 2012 and it was the Black Lives Matter movement was still fairly new, and it was still fairly nascent, that could have been the reason, right? So you have all of these things that play out. But over time, as we see more and more examples, as we see more and more victims of racism, police brutality, injustice in law enforcement, it starts to spark more and more people getting along and going along with this movement and this hashtag and this socially conscious awareness of the fact that Black lives didn't matter and Black lives should matter. And so if we go to the next slide, you start to see as more and more examples of these, the murdering and the injustices around Black men and Black women at the hands of the police or either at the hands of white vigilantes continue to happen. You start to see this movement get stronger and stronger. Again, we start with Trayvon Martin, and then you also have other examples. One particularly a gentleman by the name of Jordan Davis that actually happened right in our backyard. Jordan Davis was a young man who lived with his, I believe he lived with his mother in Marietta, Georgia, a suburb of Atlanta, Georgia. And he came to Jacksonville, Florida. I forgot why he was in Jacksonville. I think he was visiting his dad, but there was some reason he was visiting. He was visiting Jacksonville. And while he was there, he was with some friends. And they were at a gas station and they had their music being played very loudly. And a white man came to their car and told them to cut the music down. And they cut the music back up because they felt like they didn't have to do what he told them to do. He wasn't a police officer. He wasn't an authority figure. He was just a regular white guy. And they did not turn the music down, and he got upset and grabbed his gun and shot the car up. And Jordan Davis was one of the gentlemen that was murdered, right? And so that occurred. The guy did receive prison time for it. He did not receive prison time for the murder. He received prison time for the attempted murder. I forgot how they phrased his verdict, but it was the attempted murder of the gentleman that did not die, but he did not receive time for the actual murder itself. I didn't understand that. Maybe that's a lawyer thing. Jonathan Farrell, he went to Florida A&M University. He was visiting. He was driving through North Carolina. He got lost. He knocked on the door to try to get some help. The person he knocked on the door to get some help. The person came to the door and shot him and killed him. And I don't think that they received any prison time. Sandra Bland in Texas, another woman who was pulled over because of, I think, a broken tail light. She was arrested. She was placed in prison and then mysteriously died while in prison. And many people believe that she was murdered because there was nothing to suggest that she would have killed herself. So there's still some speculation around how she died. And so it is these murders and countless other deaths that have caused the rise and the continual rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so one thing that the author does, which I think is very important, is that the author couches this conversation within the framework of critical race theory. And talks about why it is important to look at this from a critical race perspective, right? As we know, there is a huge battle and there is a huge push for colleges, universities, even K through 12 schools to stop talking about critical race theory, move away from critical race theory. There's this huge push for that. And so that's why I think it's extremely important to talk about it even now, because the idea of anti-critical race theoretical discourse is, many people believe, is a way for certain groups, certain people who may be more conservative, who are seen as being pro-American, who do not agree with many of the ideas around Black Lives Matter and the social movements of the present day, are suggesting that it is this framework, it is this discourse of critical race theory that is messing up our students. It is filling their heads with ideas of anti-Americanism. It is filling their, it is psychologically damaging to many of our students. And so it should be taken out of our schools. So that is part of the conversation. While others disagree, and others do believe that critical race theory is important because it tells the honest truth about where America is, what America has done, and ways that we can improve, so that we can all be better people and we can make a better country for everyone. So going to page 308 is where we'll start. And here's where we start talking about critical race theory and the 6 elements of it. So the first element is that critical race theory is, it recognizes that racism is an integral part of the United States. So that is one of the first things that critical race theory does. Critical race theory says that racism is part of the foundation of America, right, of the United States. And some people don't like that idea. Some people don't like that that's said, but it is supported by the fact that ever since the United States became an official country in what some people may say 1777, there has been slavery, right? There has been slavery, there has been racism. At the very core of slavery is racism. And the United States would not be where it is economically had it not been for the years and decades and centuries of free Black labor. Racism is also seen as being very integral to the United States because the early forefathers and foremothers, early policies, documents, procedures, and traditions of U.S. culture was and is racist. Three-Fifths Compromise, Fugitive Slave Act, the Indian Removal Act of 1830. I mean, we can go on and on and on, right? Of the various policies that were used to help promote advantages for white people and to promote disadvantages for people of color. So the first argument is that at its very core, racism exists and is a part of the story of the United States. And it's difficult to, it's difficult to deny that. Secondly, critical race theory rejects dominant legal and social claims of neutrality, objectivity, And colorblindness, laws, policies, slogans, and other rhetorical devices promoted as race neutral are criticized. So the idea that we live in a colorblind society, the idea that we live in a society where people can actually look beyond race, and that we should look beyond race, is resisted by critical race theory, because to suggest that we should not see race is to disregard who a person is and a person's experiences. It's also just completely untrue. You can't say that you are colorblind because you stop at red lights, right? And you go at green lights. So you're not colorblind. You see color. Everyone sees color. And there's nothing wrong with seeing color. There's nothing wrong with seeing a person and them identifying as Black or white or Asian or Latinx or Native American or whatever, or mixed race. It's perfectly fine as long as there's no hierarchy attached to that labeling. Third, the third core element of critical race theory rejects analyses of contemporary racial relations void of any historical context that frames current realities. They believe that any attempt to understand race in the 21st century are only possible through an awareness of the history of race in the United States. Some people don't like to bring up slavery. Some people don't like to bring up Jim Crow. Some people don't like to bring up lynching. Some people don't like to bring up the Trail of Tears. Some people don't like to bring up the many other examples of racism that has occurred in US history. And so many people who are anti-critical race theory tells us that we should just focus on what happens now or what has happened in the past few years, and that we should forget about those things. While at the same time, those same people say that we should never forget 9/11, which is true. We should never forget 9/11, or that we should never forget the American Revolution, which is why we celebrate the 4th of July. And many historical traditions and historical things that United States citizens hold fast to. And so this idea, this third core element, is where critical race theory says, no, while we are remembering all of these good things about our history, we should also remember the challenges. We should also remember the very heinous things that have happened in the country's history, because you can only do better by acknowledging that you have done wrong. That's the only way you can really be better. If you are trying to be a better person, then you have to look at yourself or go to therapy or go somewhere and acknowledge, I have done wrong. This is where I have done wrong, and this is where I need to do better. And that's the only way you can be. And so some people don't want to do that. And many of those people are people who are anti-critical race theory. Not saying all of them, but many of them are. The fourth key element of critical race theory focuses on the experiential knowledge that is generated from various cultural standpoints. So in other words, the theory values perspectives grounded through the racialized collective experiences of those groups that have historically been marginalized. So critical race theory accepts qualitative research in the experiences of people from all racial groups. Critical race theory is not just a theory that is about Black people or Black men or Black women, but it accepts people from various racial groups, various class groups, various gender identities, various regional identities, because all of these are important in understanding the racialized experiences of people in the United States. The fifth key element speaks to the interdisciplinary and synergistic nature of critical race theory. So critical race theory is intersectional. Basically, what I just said. It is not just about one race or one gender in one race or one class in one race, but it is about the intersection of all of these identities and what is important to all of these identities and helping to create a better country. And then lastly, critical race theory highlights the social activism associated with the theory. So protests, movements, voting, culture, art, knowledge, academics, hashtags, all of these things are important and a part of critical race theory. All of these things are significant to critical race theory and respond to critical race theory, as well as advances critical race theory. And critical race theory recognizes, understands, and accepts all of these forms of protests. And so When we look at critical race theory and we look at that in terms of the hashtags and Black Lives Matter, we start to see that critical race theory absolutely supports Black Lives Matter and the Black Lives Matter movement, because there are a lot of things within the Black Lives Matter movement that fall in line with critical race theory, particularly intersectionality and the acceptance of not just the Black lives of men or the Black lives of middle-class people, but also the Black lives of women, the Black lives of trans people, the Black lives of the LGBTQIA plus community, all Black lives. And so after the end of 2014, this is when you start to see a wide acknowledgement of Black Lives Matter. I recall when Black Lives Matter first started, and organizations that I was with and groups that I was with were rallying around this notion. Many people did not accept it. Yeah, there was even a time where Black Lives Matter movements, members, and people were on the FBI list. Black Lives Matter organizations were on the FBI list for being a group that would be looked at as a terrorist organization. Now Black Lives Matter is painted on the nation's capital, the streets leading up to, I believe, the nation's capital, or the White House, or something along those lines in DC. So Black Lives Matter has now been very much accepted. It is a call to action, and it is now more along the lines of an organized civil rights movement. But there was a time where it was not. So it just goes to show that if you stay firm in what you believe, and if you're doing things for the right reason, people may not agree with you in the very beginning, but sometimes eventually people will. Sometimes it could be a good thing. Sometimes it could be not so good, because then it can get watered down. But the early demonstrations in places like St. Louis and in Boston, all the way through November and December, and Black Lives Matter has established that this rallying cry is more than just a talking point. It's more than just something to say when people are protesting, but it is an actual movement that has local chapters, that has key metropolitan areas, that have key leaders that are involved in this movement. Very similar to the civil rights movement. When you think about the civil rights movement, what it is, it wasn't just one organization. There were several organizations involved in the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement is just kind of the catch-all phrase that we use to talk about racial protests and economic protests in the 1960s. So you had the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, you had Congress of Racial Equality, so you had SNCC, you had CORE, you had SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. You had the group of the Brotherhood of Pullman Porters, I believe. I mean, there's just so many organizations that all kind of come under the civil rights movement. And Black Lives Matter is very similar. This is kind of a catch-all phrase, but there are other organizations, groups. Some of them are called Black Lives Matter. Some of them are called Black Lives Matter of whatever. Some of them are chapters of Black Lives Matter. Some of them call themselves other organizations. So it's very similar in that way. But the movement, some people ask the question, well, what is this movement for? Everybody's saying Black Lives Matter and the Black Lives Matter movement. And just like the civil rights movement had an agenda, just like the Black Power movement, or particularly the Black Panther Party, their 10-point plan had an agenda. Black Lives Matter and the movement and the organizations that fall under this overall movement have an agenda. Number one, the ending of and the addressing of racial profiling of any person of any racial group. It also addresses police brutality and the injustice that law enforcement push towards specific groups of people. So police brutality, it also addresses the militarization of the police, and the fact that the police have been allowed to have military weapons, get military training, and use military tactics on everyday citizens, the same tactics that are used on people who are seen as a threat to the nation, a threat to the safety of the United States. These same tactics, these same guns, these same strategies are used on people who make a left turn without a, and didn't use their blinker, people who jaywalk, people who knock on doors and, just asking for help, or if a police officer goes up to a car and smells, or they either smells weed or say they smell weed, and then you have this situation of police brutality, or the hyper militarization of the police, and then mass incarceration. So how prisons and jails have been filled with people, particularly Black people, and at a rate that's extremely disproportionate to other racial groups. And then, of course, how the United States itself has this overall prison industrial complex where they incarcerate their citizens at a rate that far, 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 far exceeds any country that remotely comes close to it. So the hyper incarceration of its citizens is an issue that Black Lives Matter addresses. Some of the critics of Black Lives Matter critiques are that it is rebellious, that it is anti-American, that it doesn't have one particular leader, that they are unfocused, that they are trying to deal with too many things at one time, and then it's a fleeting movement. It's hype at one point, it's hype when a child dies or someone dies unjustly, and then after that moment it dies down, then it comes back up again and it dies down. So these are the things that many people believe are the critiques of the Black Lives Matter movement. The overall goals of the movement is, number one, to pass policy and legislation to address all of these things that I stated before, to have congressional hearings and conversations with people across the political spectrum, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, Green Party, conservatives, liberals, everybody, people who are in the federal government, state government, local government, having these hearings and having these discussions so that we can reach and come to legislation that will help to ensure the safety of all U.S. citizens. The indictment of officers who have clearly violated the rights of U.S. citizens, regardless of race, regardless of color, regardless of gender, etc. Those officers who have violated those rights should be indicted. They should be held accountable. They should go to and they should be punished to the fullest extent of the law. They should have their day in court, as any U.S. citizen has. They should be treated to a fair trial, just like any U.S. citizen has. And they should also make sure that if they are found guilty, in a way that is fair, then they should also receive a fair punishment. And then lastly, the goal of the movement is to raise the consciousness of America, which I think it definitely has. If they've done any of these things, I think that has been the greatest victory of the Black Lives Matter movement, which is the raising of the consciousness of America and making more people inside the country and outside the country aware of the various things that particularly racial minorities in America have been dealing with for a very long time, and forcing people to come to grips with the racial injustices happening in the United States. Let's see. So in response to Black Lives Matter, there have been oppositional groups and oppositional discourse created. Some of you may be familiar with it, but when Black Lives Matter started to become more and more popular and people began to say Black Lives Matter, you had a counter narrative of all lives matter. People began to say, well, it's not just that Black Lives Matter, it's really that all lives matter. And so when people say that all lives matter, what do they mean by that? What does it mean when people say all lives matter? What I would like for you to do is I would like for you to click on this link, and you can just watch the first 5 minutes. And I want you to kind of think through some of the things that they're talking about in this link. And then we'll come back to the lecture. And so After listening to that, um, this notion of all lives matter is a way of, some people believe is a way of saying, hey, we can't just focus on Black people or saying just Black lives matter, because that's unfair. Black people, Black people's lives are the only lives that matter in this country. All people's lives matter in this country. White people's lives matter. Asian people's lives matter. Latinx people's lives matter. Everybody's lives matter in this country. And I think people who agree with the ideas and the principles of Black Lives Matter would also agree with those principles, that all lives do matter. Everyone's life matters. What Black Lives Matter is saying is that Black lives are the lives that are at stake here, because these are the lives that are constantly being taken away from us unjustly. And so clearly, all lives don't matter because these lives are being lost. So we need to specify that Black people's lives matter too. We need to put the Black back in the all. And once Black, and not only Black, but Black is included in the rest of the lives that seem to matter, then we can say all lives matter. But clearly, people who are saying all lives matter don't think that all lives matter, because these Black lives are the ones that are being snuffed out. So the question then remains, well, why do you think that Fox News used conservative Black people to push this line of thought? And just like any group, just like white people, just like Latinx people, everybody does not agree, or everybody does not think the same thing. You have millions and millions of Black people. And so in those millions and millions of Black people, all of those Black people do not agree or look at everything in the same way. The same way in the civil rights movement. Um, you had a large number of people who agreed with Dr. King's approach, but you also had a very large number of Black people who did not agree with Dr. King's approach. And you had an even larger number of white people who did not agree with Dr. King's approach and felt like being peaceful and praying was radical, and that he was a terrorist, and that he was a communist, and that he was a threat to the safety of the United States, because he said that people should be nonviolent in their protests and that we should pray for our enemies. So I just imagine that if a man who was saying that we should pray for our enemies and we should love our enemies is violent and a threat, I can just imagine what somebody else in that same position, how they would be viewed. So that just goes to show that everybody in any group does not think the exact same way, right? Um, so a person might say, well, they use conservative Black people or Black people who were anti-Black Lives Matter to push this line of thought to say, hey, look, even some of your own people believe this or are not in agreement with this idea or this philosophy, right? And so this is by design, right? This is by design. And this is done all the time. It's not just done in race, it's also done in gender. You have some women who are feminists. You have some women who believe in equal opportunity for people across gender groups. But then you have some women who are not feminists, who are anti-feminists, who believe that men should be in charge, that men are the better leaders, that men are the better authority figures. And there are some women who believe that. And typically, those men who want to continue to push that agenda will get those women and give them the platform to say, hey, talk, speak, and then tell those pro-feminist women to say, hey, even your own women say that men should be in the limelight or men should be the leaders. And so these are the ways that in which dominant groups take on those examples out of the marginalized group to push their agenda, because they know if they say it, then it may receive even more vitriol. Black Lives Matter represents this new form of online activism, with Twitter being the site of the revolution. And so now, before, sites for revolution may have been churches, sites for protests may have been in the streets, sites of protests may have been in the academic classrooms, it may have even been on television. But now, sites of protests are where? Right on your phone. Hashtags, Twitter, Instagram, now Snapchat and TikTok, right? These are now the forms of online activism, right? And this is the new way in which the revolutions um, are pushed forward. Let's see. Uh, sure, I have this together. And so the problem with All Lives Matter is what? Well, number one, it states that Obama's election suggested that we live in a post-racial society. We've already talked about that. I think we talked about that when we dealt with colorblind racism. But All Lives Matter says, well, now that Obama has been elected and white people elected a black president, this means everything in terms of race has been done away with, because nobody who's racist would elect a black leader. That's not necessarily true. Just because someone is racist doesn't necessarily mean that they are automatically would automatically not agree with a black leader, because race and racism is much more nuanced than that. Okay, much more nuanced than that. And we're not going to go too deep into that, but the election of one black president does not necessarily say that we live in a post-racial society. All Lives Matter also promotes colorblindness, saying that I don't see color. And we've already talked about how that is problematic. All Lives Matter also suggests that black people are playing the race card. We've talked about that with colorblind racism. All of these we talked about as it pertains to the colorblind ideology. And so this notion of black people or people of color playing the race card or using race as a way to get what they want is one of the critiques that All Lives Matter says people who believe in All Lives Matter say about black people and people who agree with or who fall along the lines of the Black Lives Matter philosophy. And so if we look at the comparisons between Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter, this is what you see, right? Going to the next slide. You see that Black Lives Matter responds to inequality that is steeped in American history, right? Very similar to critical race theory, showing that inequality is something that has always been very much a part of the American story. All Lives Matter responds to Black Lives Matter, right? So All Lives Matter is reactionary, and Black Lives Matter is coming from a position that this is how our society lives. This is how our society functions and has always functioned. And this is just an example of continued protest that has happened since 1619, since the first African was brought over to the Americas as an enslaved person. Black Lives Matter promotes eradicating racism. So Black Lives Matter is not saying that Black people should be better than anybody or that white people should be, but that we need to get rid of racism altogether so that all races are equal. All Lives Matter promotes post-racism. So All Lives Matter says that we are not as racist as we used to be, but now All Lives Matter promotes colorblind, what Bonilla Silver would say is colorblind racism, right? So there's this kind of post notion of racism by saying we should get rid of critical race theory. We should not talk about race. We should be colorblind. We should ignore race. These are post-racial racist actions. Black Lives Matter addresses pre and post civil rights racism. So it says that you had issues related to segregation. You had issues related to Jim Crow. You had issues related to that were passed down from slavery. You had issues related to lynching. You had issues related to the chain gang. All of these kind of institutions and types of racism that existed pre 1960, or maybe you might want to even go to 1954, Brown v. Board, and post-civil rights. So mass incarceration, police brutality, um, um, concentrated poverty. All of these different examples of post-civil rights racism, right? All Lives Matter says we should not talk about past and present day racism. We need to get rid of discussing racism altogether, right? Which is one reason why there is this attack on critical race theory, right? We need to stop talking about race and racism and move forward. Black Lives Matter says if Black Lives Matter, then that is included in All Lives Matter. So basically, when we say Black Lives Matter, we're not saying other lives don't matter. It is just saying that Black Lives Matter as well as the other lives, because it seems as though Black lives don't matter. All Lives Matter says that if all lives matter, then we can exclude the Black lives that don't. We don't have to say Black Lives Matter because all lives matter. When we say all lives matter, that means we don't have to talk about any other lives except for white lives. When we say all lives matter, subconsciously what we're saying is that white lives matter, and then everybody else, depending on how close they come to being a white life, based on their gender, based on their class, based on how they act. Black Lives Matter refutes colorblindness and says that we should see color, we should see race, but we should not treat people differently based on their color or race. And All Lives Matter says, well, and not even to say that, because sometimes you do have to adjust how you behave based on somebody's culture, because race is connected to culture in a lot of ways, but you should not treat someone better or worse. But you may be different, right? And that's okay. If I were to go to a place that had all people of a certain race representing a certain culture, I may not say certain things. I may not do certain things because it may not even be understood. I'll give you an example. One of my professors in graduate school, and she was also kind of a mentor of mine as well. Her name was Dr. Jean, and she took a group of us to China to do research. And she would often invite us over to her house in every January or February, I think it was every January or every year. And we would celebrate Chinese New Year at her house. And she would have students of, various racial groups, Black students, white students, Chinese students, Asian students that were from other countries in Asia. And we would celebrate Chinese New Year. Well, I would go there and we may ask questions, we'll tell jokes, we'll laugh, we'll eat, we'll learn. But it would be weird to act there or tell the same jokes or make the same assumptions in that space that I would if I were to visit an HBCU homecoming. Does that make sense? Because it's two different cultures, it's two different races. So I would not behave or act or expect the same thing, right? And vice versa. If an Asian person were to go to a Chinese New Year and then turn around and go to a HBCU homecoming, it's two very different places. The difference is when we talk about race and racism and colorblindness, the difference is we see color, we see culture, we see race, and you act accordingly, or ask questions or whatever, or be as respectful as possible. The difference with racism is says that Chinese New Year is greater than HBCU homecoming, or HBCU homecoming is greater or better than a Chinese New Year. We need to get rid of Chinese New Year because they don't follow the same ideas that we do here. Or we need to get rid of HBCUs because they don't follow you see what I'm saying? So when you start to put a hierarchy or a better or worse, but you can see race, you can see culture, and you can even adjust conversations or adjust what you might do or how you might behave based on that, because that's just being polite, right? So why we say Black Lives Matter? The reason why Black Lives Matter is a thing, the reason why we say it is because of the ways in which racism continues to exist in our society. In one way, it is because of the continued mass incarceration and the disproportionate number of Black people that are detained and that are incarcerated in the penal system. These numbers were extremely large in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and the early 2000s. They've gone down some because of movements like Black Lives Matter, because of the constant push and the constant critique of policies like the 1988 crime bill and the 1994 crime bill that have continued to be policies that have disproportionately negatively affected Black people, Black communities, particularly poor Black communities. And so with books like The New Jim Crow, which we've talked about in other resources, it is shown that we need to do a much better job of addressing the issue of mass incarceration in our society. The unbalanced media attention when Black and white people go missing. And so typically when a white person goes missing or when something happens to a white person, there's this outcry. But a lot of times when Black people go missing, particularly Black girls or Black women, it doesn't get the same media attention. And so that's another reason why people say Black Lives Matter. The health disparities. And so the fact that Black women are more likely to die in childbirth than white women. The fact that oftentimes Black people have higher negative effects or higher death rates with certain diseases than white people, right? All of these health disparities, the fact that Black women are oftentimes not believed, and this is something that has been admitted by doctors, by some of the highest doctors in the nation, have admitted to saying oftentimes Black women are not believed to be in pain or to be in distress or when they say they're hurting or when they say that something is wrong. Many times they're not believed until it's too late. And we've talked about that before. And so these health disparities, the death rates, even when you look at COVID-19 and the fact that people of color, particularly poor people of color, were dying at a higher rate, not necessarily just because they were a person of color, but also because these people were less likely to have access to the proper healthcare necessary to deal with the COVID-19, right? So when you have issues like a pandemic, these exacerbate the already existing health disparities that that are maintained and persisted in our country, in our society. And then lastly, unfair institutional support. And so the fact that oftentimes Black institutions, Black schools, Black colleges do not get the same institutional support, don't get the same support from the state, don't get the same support from the city as oftentimes white institutions, and not just colleges, but also hospitals, also 501c3s, all different types of institutions that are specific to a certain racial group. These things are unfair along racial lines. And so this is another reason why people say that Black Lives Matter, right? Also, when we say Black Lives Matter and when we push for the inclusion of Black people, this is also including, or this is a part of the overall push for racial equality as a whole. Because in sociology, we argue along this Black-white binary. And historically, prior to the large influx of Latinx people, the large influx of Asian Americans, you had Blackness that was on the far left side, and you had whiteness that was on the far right side. And the closer a person gets to whiteness, the better they're treated in the United States. And so the closer you get to Blackness, the worse that you're treated. And so as more and more racial groups begin to come into the country, then they find where they fit on this Black-white spectrum. It's not to say that if we fight for Black lives or if we make sure that Black people have equal opportunity, that will automatically include everybody else. We also have to be mindful that we are addressing issues that are related to all racial groups, all groups, right? However, while we are addressing these, we're also being specific about Black lives as well. So these are the constant conversations, discourse, complexities of addressing race in the United States, right? So we are constantly having to have these. One thing about Black Lives Matter and what it has done, it is that it has caused for the offshoots of other movements. It has caused for this hashtag Stop Asian Hate movement. It has caused for the Me Too movement. All of this has come out of Black Lives Matter, and it has sparked other groups to start their own movement, their own organizations, their own platforms to address inequality in their specific subgroups. So, with that being said, you have a discussion question or discussion questions to participate in. So you've done this before, you've seen these slides. And going down to the slide that says Black Lives Matter discussion, you are required to engage in the discussion board entitled Black Lives Matter, and you will address the following prompt, which I believe is a part of your your reading. What are your thoughts on hashtag activism? In what ways is Black Lives Matter as a hashtag similar to or different from other movements started or enhanced by hashtags like Me Too, Oscar So White, I'm With Her, Pray for Paris, Bring Back Our Girls, Arab Spring, etc.? What are your thoughts on the Blue Lives Matter movement? Is this movement similar to Black Lives Matter? So the deadline to complete this is Friday, November 12th at 1 p.m. All instructions on the previous slide should be fulfilled before that day and time. If you have any questions, reach out to me. So lastly, what we're going to do is we're going to discuss Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. Man, I really, really, really hope that you participated in this reading. Hold on, let me make sure. Let me go grab it real quick because we're going to be going through this text. Okay, so Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. Absolutely by far one of the most important books of the 21st century, by far. If you have not read it, whether you're in sociology or not, if you're just a person who is building your library, if you like the things that we've been discussing, if you just want good reading, absolutely. As you can see already, number one New York bestseller, even though that's not really, that is saying a lot, but it's a lot of books that say they're the number one New York bestseller. But this one really should be. It's, yeah, definitely one of the most important texts. And if you were in my sociological theory class, we talked about this as it pertains to The Fire Next Time, which absolutely is one of the most important books of the 20th century. So a lot of people have equated this text as the second coming of The Fire Next Time and looked at Ta-Nehisi Coates as almost the second coming of James Baldwin. Okay. Anyway, what is Between the World and Me about after you read it? What is it about to you? Okay. What is it about to you? To me, Between the World and Me is a book that Ta-Nehisi Coates is writing to his son. Very similarly to James Baldwin, who writes The Fire Next Time, a series of letters, really mainly two letters that he breaks up into two sections of the book that he's writing to his nephew. And it's published in 1963. And it takes on, I'm talking about that and I'm gonna come to Ta-Nehisi Coates. It takes on the ideas of race in America and puts it in a way to where this uncle is teaching his son, or this uncle is teaching his nephew about how to navigate race in 1960s America. Preferably as it comes to the 100-year anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. Remember, I said it was published in 1963, the Emancipation Proclamation, the document that was said to end slavery. It really didn't, but it was said to, was passed in 1863. So it is a letter that James Baldwin is actually writing to his nephew to teach him about this world that he's getting ready to be a part of. Powerful, powerful, powerful book. And an incredible analysis of race. I don't agree. with, I don't want to say a lot, but some significant points that Baldwin brings out, but still very important. Very important. And maybe if I lived during that time, I probably would have agreed. Who knows? But living in a post-Black Power, post-civil rights, Black Lives Matter era, it's kind of like, But this text, very, very similar. Ta-Nehisi Coates is a father. He has a son. I think his son was maybe about 9 or 10 when he maybe started writing this book, or either when it was published. And this is a book to his son. And he's talking to his son about race in present day America. Interestingly enough, though, I think he might have been in Paris when he was writing it, because I know he had I think a fellowship or something, and he got paid a lot of money to just kind of sit and write. So that's definitely his class advantage there. But he worked hard for that class advantage because he did not come from upper class status. Ta-Nehisi Coates was born and raised in a lower middle class, working class family in Baltimore. He was born, he was raised in Baltimore in the 70s, maybe the 1970s and 80s. He was there around the onset of hip hop. So if you read this book, hip hop plays a huge role in how he understands life. Rap music plays a big role in how he understands his position in the city as a Black man in America. He also comes up during the crack epidemic. So he sees drugs, he sees drug dealers, drugs play an influence in his community. He later goes on to attend Howard University. He loves Howard University. In fact, now he's a professor at Howard University. Howard University is a historically Black college in Washington, D.C., and he calls it the Mecca. He is a huge Howard University fan. He does not graduate. He eventually drops out of college and pursues his dreams of being a writer. And it takes him a while to get there, but he does eventually get there. And by Ta-Nehisi Coates, I want to say he was the editor of the college magazine or college newspaper, if I'm not mistaken, and a very, very, very proud product of Howard University. And the way in which he writes, his eloquence, his delivery, his knowledge of history, his knowledge of books, his knowledge of literature far exceeds many people who probably did graduate from Howard University. His stories of friends who have been killed by the police, or friends who have been arrested, or situations that have occurred in his life that helps him make sense of race in America. He's now translating these ideas into a letter to his son. A phenomenal, phenomenal, phenomenal text. Unlike James Baldwin's Fire Next Time, his analysis does not end with hope. His analysis more so ends with the idea that, you know what, son, James Baldwin ends The Fire Next Time saying, I believe in hope for America. I believe if we can appeal to white people and appeal to the consciousness and educate them and help them understand that things are going to be better. And Ta-Nehisi Coates says, son, it's just the way it is. And I don't know if it's going to ever change. I don't think so. Right? So there is this bitter reality. There is this truthfulness. There's this transparency of the world in which we live from the perspective of a young Black, of a older Black male to his son, and helping him to prepare for this world to come. So is this between the world and me? Well, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. Is this between the world and me that he's talking about, between my world and then my son's world? But then it's also between the world and me, this white world and this Black world that he is kind of dealing with all at the same time. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. If you get a chance, definitely do the reading for the class. but you should also do the reading for you should also, if there was any book I would say you should check out from this class, this will absolutely be one of them in its entirety. So Between the World and Me is essentially what is, that is what it is about. Also, if we go to page 7, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and I want you to look at the paragraph that says, but race. He says, but race is the child of racism, not the father. And the process of naming the people has never been a matter of genealogy. I can't even pronounce that word. I meant to do it before I came on here. Physiognomy. So much as one of hierarchy. Difference in hue and hair is old, but the belief in the preeminence of hue and hair, the notion that these factors can correctly organize a society and that they signify deeper attributes which are indelible, this is the new idea at the heart of these new people who have been brought up hopelessly, tragically, deceitfully to believe that they are white. So he says race is the child of racism, not the father. What does that mean? What is he suggesting here? My thoughts are that he's saying racism came first, and then race was used to support racism. Racism is the belief that people should be placed on a hierarchy based on these attributes that we call race: skin color and hair and nose size, lip size, culture. All these things play a role in how intelligent or how intelligent or how righteous or how moral someone is. But the system was created first, and then race and the names and the context and the meanings and the policies and the institutions and the art that were connected to race came afterwards. Racism was the idea of the slave trade, was the idea of the transatlantic slave trade. Because actually, to be fair, and my argument would be capitalism preceded both of those. Essentially, and did we go here in this class? The short history of race. I think we read that in this class. I think we did. We talked about the fact that initially there was no such thing as race. And when the transatlantic slave trade happened, it was really all for money. It wasn't that people first started to dislike Black people or African people. White people didn't have a problem. Europeans didn't have a problem with Africans. In fact, a lot of Europeans looked up to Africans because they knew the stories of Egypt. They knew the stories of Ethiopia. They knew how much gold and resources were on the continent. They liked the fact that they had this amazing military. They had no problem with Africans. But the expansion of greed and the need for labor and the need for labor with a distinct coloration, a distinct skin coloration, was necessary. Started with European immigrants, then they went to Native Americans, and that didn't work. Long story. So then and actually it was a Spanish explorer who later regretted what he said, but he encouraged them to no longer enslave the Native Americans, say you should actually go over there and get those Africans. They're dark skinned, they don't know the land, they don't know this land, but they know the land. They know how to plow, they know farming, they can survive in the southern region. You should go get them. So it had less to do with race and more to do with economics. They were just the better labor choice, if you will. So that's my argument. Ta-Nehisi Coates goes on to say, then there was the creation of racism. So we have to find a way to justify subjugating these people. We create racism, and then we find a way of subjugating it by creating race. We'll call these people Black. We have to call us something else, so we'll call us white. And then we have to attach meaning to this based on their skull size, based on their culture. These people come from the jungle. The ham in the Bible was cursed. All these different meanings and reasons that would suggest Black means X, white means X. That's my interpretation of what he means when he says race is the child of racism. The subjugation in the system was created first, and then you had to create meaning that went alongside race. And so then, as we move forward in the reading, he goes on to say, or he goes on to talk about some of the things that are going on. This was published in 2015. So he goes on to talk about on page 8 and 9, he talks about some of the same people we just discussed. Eric Garner, who was choked out in New York for selling cigarettes. Renisha McBride, who was shot for seeking help when her car broke down. Another Black woman who was brutally murdered. John Crawford, who was shot for browsing in a department store. Tamir Rice, he was 12 years old, outside playing with a gun, and the police pulled up at a park. He was playing with a toy gun, and the police pulled up at a park and shot him dead. And in all these situations, I don't think any police officers or anybody saw any jail time. So what is going on in American history that Coates is using to frame his discussion on race? The Black Lives Matter movement. Exactly the same way in which James Baldwin used the civil rights movement to address his nephew and explain to him the world he's getting ready to go into. Ta-Nehisi Coates says, son, this is the world you're getting ready to go into. Let me tell you what's happening around you. Let me tell you what's happening to people that look like you. And he is using this moment in American history to warn his son and to prepare his son for this world. You live in a world and they live in a world. And your world has to navigate the world in a different way that their world does. So this is what's going on in American history that is causing Coates to have this conversation with his son. And then on page 12, let's look at page 12. The part that I really like, so you see a picture of him and his son on page 13. Page 12, if we go down to the middle part of that paragraph, he says, how do I live free in this Black body? It is a profound question because America understands itself as God's handiwork, but the Black body is the clearest evidence that America is the work of men. What does that mean? It's powerful. Very, very powerful. What is he saying here? If we look at things like what's called manifest destiny, certain documents within US history, there's this idea that God has blessed America, that God has looked upon America and has blessed this country with freedom, with democracy, with the opportunity to show the world that there can be a place that can live without oppression, without tyranny, to show that people can live in harmony and peacefully, and that if a person works hard, they can achieve great success just from their merits. That is the idea of America. That is part of the American principles. What Bonilla Silva would call abstract liberalism. These abstract ideas of the American philosophy, what Barack Obama would call the American experiment. But Ta-Nehisi Coates says, but Black people say that, so according to white people, particularly white middle-class people, would suggest that America is God's handiwork. God created this beautiful country to show the rest of the world how humans should behave. But Black people in America, is evident that God did not create this country. Men created this country, because what man creates, inequality follows. America's not the first country to have inequality. Inequality has been existing since the world exists. It's just that America's no different. And so to the white body, America's God's handiwork. But to the Black body, America is the work of men. Because Black people remind America, Black people remind the United States, Black people remind this world that it is absolutely flawed at its core. It is a flawed place, it is a flawed space, and it is a place that exists for the betterment of certain groups, of certain people, which again goes back to the title of the text. There is a different world that exists between you and me. We embody this world, and then there is another world. There is one world where people believe that America is God's handiwork, and there is our world that reminds them that it is not. And so then if we go to pages, so then he goes on, if we go to page 20 and 21, I really wanted to talk there. This is where he goes deeper into this notion of these two worlds. Remember, he's talking about between the world and me as an older Black man, and I've navigated and I am navigating this world. So I have my world, and then I'm talking to you world, which again, going back to the hip hop references, there's a famous song by an early hip hop pioneer called Hey Young World by Slick Rick, for those who may be hip hop historians. Hey Young World is a very popular rap song, came out in the 1980s or early 1990s. So he could also be playing along that, where Slick Rick is talking to the younger generation and talking to them about how to be better, how to improve their lifestyle, and how to be positive contributors to society. So this notion of world and people, right, is what Ta-Nehisi Coates is playing on. Then he goes on in page 20, about halfway down, and says, he says, there were little white boys with complete collection. No, I'm sorry. Let me go back one sentence. He says, in the evenings, I would sit before this television, bearing witness to the dispatches from this other world. There were little white boys with complete collections of football cards, and their only want was a popular girlfriend, and their only worry was poison oak. That other world was suburban and endless, organized around pot roasts, blueberry pies, fireworks, ice cream, sundaes, immaculate bathrooms, and small toy trucks that were loose in wooded backyards with streams and glens. Comparing these dispatches with the facts of my native world, I came to understand that my country was a galaxy, and this galaxy stretched from the pandemonium of West Baltimore to the happy hunting grounds of Mr. Belvedere. I obsessed over the distance between the other sector of space and my own. I knew that my portion of the American galaxy, where bodies were enslaved by tenacious gravity, was Black, and that the other liberated portion was not. I knew that some inscrutable energy preserved the breach I felt, but did not yet understand the relation between that other world and me. And I felt in this a cosmic injustice, a profound cruelty, which infused an abiding, irrepressible desire to unshackle my body and achieve the velocity of escape. Very beautifully written, poetic, if you will. What does this mean to you? What do you take away from this passage? How do you summarize the meaning of that text? I will give you my suggesting, but I think it's a good way to end with your thoughts, because that's a very important section. And it's there that he takes you into his analysis. So think through that. You don't have to write that down. You don't have to send it to me, but think about it. Reread it if you have to. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this. Make sure you complete your quiz. Make sure you complete the discussion assignment. I hope you are reading the PowerPoints, the lectures. By now, you should know to follow this so that you know what assignments are coming and when they're due. And yes, if you have any questions, reach out, call me. Text me, not text me, inbox me, email me, or come in during office hours. Hope you have a great day, great week, great weekend. See you soon.